So I hope you can make out what's on the board there, and I know that even if you can, it's going to be backwards. But basically, every time that my students come into the classroom, there's an aim on the board. The aim is the question that I want them to be able to answer by the end of the class. Sometimes I do that through assessment. I mean, it's always an assessment. But sometimes I'll have them do what's called an exit ticket. So the last activity of the day might be answering the aim in their journal, or giving me on a half a sheet of paper a written answer to the aim. I like to have them write every day, even if it's just for a brief 3 to 4 minutes. It's a skill that many students are kind of losing a facility for these days. I mean, they're writing more than ever, but with the texting, the language in a way is kind of becoming bastardized, if I can use that term. So the aim today is, how did England become a constitutional monarchy? Coming into this lesson, we talked about the age of absolutism. In particular, King Louis in France, who was, the perfect example of an absolute monarch par excellence. I mean, this guy ruled for over 50 years, where he said, I was the state, or nobody had any type of rights. Basically, what he spoke was law. So these kids know what absolute monarchy is coming in. Now we're going to try to transition into constitutional monarchy or limited monarchy and get to why people today maybe have say in government, or allegedly do, depending on what you believe. So also when they come in, they know to copy down the aim in their notebooks, journals, whatever you want to call them, because I check those at the end of every term, and it's part of their term grade assessment. And then underneath it is a do now. The do now is the thing, once they copy the aim, that they're responsible for to do. So while they're doing the do now, I am doing my general procedural things, maybe collecting homework, handing back homework, going over just housekeeping stuff. So this do now is actually discuss the following question with your neighbor, so their partner, whoever they're, depending on how the room is organized. If they're in pairs, they can do it in pairs. Sometimes we have it set up in quads, where there's 4 students grouped together. But this question is, what purposes should government serve? And I like that question because it's very, very broad. It allows for critical thinking. There's no right or wrong answer, and it's sure to generate discussion. And what I've found teaching this lesson a couple of weeks ago, and teaching it, I've taught it, probably half a dozen times at this point in my career, is a lot of kids say things like, protect the population, to protect our rights, to provide security, to have police, firefighters, ninth graders. So these guys and girls, they're basically, usually it seems like looking, well, if they're drawing off their own frame of reference. In the United States, we have a democracy here. What does the democracy do? I mean, it's supposed to protect the citizens and allow them a say in government. And usually through, this activity here will take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. It's supposed to generate a lot of discussion, classroom discussion. But we'll get to that idea that the purpose of government is to protect and serve people. And then I ask them, well, why is that? Where does that idea come from? And usually, hopefully, eventually, I'll lead them to the Constitution, because it's something that they're familiar with already, being citizens of this country. Most of them, not all of them. And then I'll have them try to discuss what's the Constitution. Well, it's written laws. Well, the example I use in this class in particular, because everybody has cell phones, because I'm trying to get these guys to think of a contract, contract between the ruler and the ruled, was I asked them, when you guys, because how many of you guys have cell phones? Every hand goes up. How many of you pay for your own cell phone? Most of the hands went down, but a few are still up. Well, when you went to get those cell phones, what did you have to do with the cell phone service provider? Oh, my mom had to sign this thing. What is that thing? And then, of course, a couple kids know it's a contract. And then we come to the idea that the contract is an agreement between one or more parties that's put into writing, that's basically establishes what one party owes the other. And then I take this idea and draw the parallel to government. Okay? So we have a contract in the United States with the government. They're to rule us fairly, and it's all written out in the Constitution and the laws that fall underneath the jurisdiction of the Constitution. So once we establish that, I basically introduce the reading portion. I don't every day is varied. The only things that I do the same every day is the aim on the board and the do now. It's just, I think it's, for me to follow or to be able to perform my household duties of handing out and distributing information and collecting homework, it works well. And for them, it's a procedure that they know and they can follow. So they know what to do when they come into class, which I think saves a lot of time where, where people or teachers that I've seen in my observations in graduate school, where they don't have that regimented procedure early on, it can kind of deteriorate quickly and become a situation that's hard to manage. We're talking about adolescence here. So once we establish that we're talking about a contract, that we're talking about an agreement between the government and the governed, I hand them the reading, which I will send to you. But the reading, essentially, it's something that I typed up myself. And it's about the English Civil War, because that's where this constitutional democracy comes from. Charles I was the King of England during the English Civil War. He actually loses his head because of it. But like Louis in France, he wanted to be an absolute monarch, right? But in England, they had this thing called the Magna Carta, which was established, in the year 1215, that basically said that the king must share power with the parliament, and he tried to overstep this law, right? So the kids read the reading that I created, and then they answer 4 questions, right, independently in their notes. They don't have to actually write the questions down in their notebooks because, in the interest of time, I'm talking about an average 40-minute class period. In the interest of time, I'd rather have them not do it, but I ask the questions in such a way that they, when they write out the answers, they should know what they're responding to. And the 4 questions are these. First one is, describe the events that led to the English Civil War. The second one is, was Parliament justified in their execution of Charles I? Why might they want to kill him rather than let him live? Third one, explain how a constitutional democracy works. And the fourth one, what kind of king do you think you would be if you knew the last one had gotten his head chopped off? Okay? And I'll explain the rationale behind each one of these. And I also have it in the written lesson plan, which you'll be getting sent to you. But the first one, describe the events that led to the English Civil War. This is just me. I want them to be able to analyze textual evidence and to recall the chronology of something. It's just a simple chain of events thing. But some of the language is difficult, and I can't show you here, but I have a smartboard in the classroom, and while they're reading the source, I have a vocabulary primer on the smartboard, so the more difficult words are projected up there with definitions to help walk them through it and kind of scaffold that activity. So describe the events that led to the English Civil War. That is there for them to kind of just have the whole chronology, point A to point Z, beginning, end, and understand, this thing started, it ended. Okay, we know that. Now, what is its significance? What is its consequence? What is its relation and importance today? Second one was, well, why did Charles I, why was he executed by Parliament? And the reason I asked this is because I want them to think, well, if the government I want them to kind of maybe come to this idea, and this is what happened in my class 2 weeks ago. Well, the government breaks its contract and then starts to abuse its power, and the people revolt because they have an agreement with the government that it's supposed to maintain or operate within certain boundaries, and it breaks that agreement. And the reason the kids thought, and I think they're accurate, that the Parliament decided to kill Charles I is because they wanted to discourage any king in the future from going outside of the bounds of the 1215 Magna Carta. If you have a contract, you have to observe that contract. So that's the second one. Explain how a constitutional democracy works. Well, I don't want to tell them, I want them to tell me. So drawing off of the source, they should be able to do that. And then lastly, what kind of king do you think you'd be if you knew the last king had gotten his head chopped off? This one got me some interesting answers, because some kids would say, well, we'd be more brutal than the last king, so people would fear us. But the idea is I want them to consider the consequences of their actions, consider the consequences of government actions, and to consider the consequences of Charles I's actions, because after the English Civil War and his execution, No other English monarch ever challenged the power of Parliament or ever asserted the right to rule absolutely again. So, I mean, I think that the whole execution thing worked because Parliament's still there today, and England is a very prosperous and stable country. Amongst, most of the countries in this world aren't very stable. So after we would reconvene, and we'd go over these questions, and depending on whether you guys have, Smartboard or PowerPoint, or you don't have any of those things, I would have the images. I would have handouts with images on them because I like to reach my learners in multiple ways. I mean, we know, and I've learned through my experience as a teacher, and then also my experience in the graduate program, that there's multiple intelligences. Certain kids respond better to other ways of acquiring information. So certainly, I always have visual, sources in there to kind of help to bolster the written information. And then where applicable, depending on what your technological capabilities are, I always also like to include a video, or some type of definitely photographic documents. Well, what's happening now in the United States in public education, and I don't teach at a public high school, I teach at a private high school, so I have a lot of freedoms, but there's this really strong focus on primary sources, and I love to use them. Well, primary and secondary sources, but not the textbook. And I actually myself, I use the textbook where applicable, and it's good, I mean, depending on which one you're using. But my preference is to kind of do what I had done in this lesson, which is have a primary source or a group of primary sources, and then, through cooperative learning, I might have pair kids up in group A, group B, and each one would read one source that the information complements each other, and then they come in and they discuss it, and they feed off of each other, and they help each other work their way through to some type of conclusion, to some type of resolution. But my ideal class, social studies or English, because the pedagogy and the methodology, I think, is very similar. I mean, English literature especially. Language arts is different. I have experience teaching that in Taiwan, and even here, where half of my kids are from mainland China. It's an international school. But I think you can structure the curriculum and the lesson and the procedures in a way where you can reach most kids. You just have to be able to adapt your instruction. You have to be reflective. And I am all those things. And I really am eager to get back to Taiwan. I know this isn't supposed to be, this is a demo lesson, but I'm being candid. I wish I could have shown you something, me in action in front of the class, but I think this will give you a good sense of who I am and what I'm all about. So the last activity, and after you watch this, or while you're watching this, I encourage you to print up one of the documents I'm going to send you to kind of help you get a sense of what's happening here, because it's hard to follow maybe without a class actually doing what I'm saying that I would have them do. The last activity would be an exit ticket assessment. Like I said, I love to use writing assessments because people are losing that ability, in my opinion. I mean, I was a pretty solid student when I was in high school, and I even have some of my high school work. It's not brilliant by any stretch, but what I'm getting these days from a lot of my students is lacking for certain. I don't think they write very often at all. So the last activity I had was, like I mentioned prior in this video, is just to have them answer the aim on a half sheet of paper and hand it in to me. And the aim is, how did England become a constitutional monarchy? So for the last 3-4 minutes, quietly at their desks, half sheet of paper, they're going to write their answer to that, okay? And it's going to show me two things. It's going to assess my instruction, and it's going to assess their knowledge acquisition. Because if they're able to tell me how this happened, how this occurred, I know that I'm achieved my goal as a teacher. If not, then I need to go back to the drawing board and revisit this, or figure out a different approach or another means of getting across this information, or trying to get them, or trying to facilitate them to finding the information themselves. My favorite way to teach is actually having them teach me, but working as, if this makes sense, working more as a guide, where I know where I want them to go, But I don't like to tell them things directly. I like to prompt them into telling me or lead them to the appropriate place. And it makes teaching much more stimulating for me and them, because I think things that people, or conclusions and knowledge that they acquire independently on their own, is much more lasting than what they're just told flat out by someone else. I think that stuff has a tendency to go in one ear and out the other. But I also understand there are cultural differences at play here. It's like I said, half of my kids are Chinese kids here in the mainland, and they almost seem more comfortable being told exactly what to do. Whereas my American kids, I have kids from the Middle East, I have kids from Australia here, they want to be independent learners. So I'm capable of functioning in both worlds. Certainly, I have functioned in both worlds. Right now I'm functioning in both worlds. But my preference is kind of to have a balance where I know where I want them to be, but I want them to get there on their own. So I hope this isn't too scatterbrained or disorganized, or I hope it is satisfactory, and I hope to hear from you again in the very near future and have a telephone interview or a Skype interview and talk about the possibilities of me coming to your school and working this year. Thank you, and I will speak with you soon.